When I was watching Donald Trump berating Zelensky, I could not help but be reminded of a giant pecking order. Donald Trump was the biggest cock in the room, and by cock, I'm talking about a rooster, and J.D. Vance was the medium cock in the room, and Zelensky was the smallest, weakest cock in the room, and there was Donald Trump pecking away, and J.D. Vance said, "Let me at him, let me peck on the weakest cock in the room," and it was really just one big geopolitical pecking order, and that was it. And what did we see in that moment? What we saw was America throwing Ukraine under the bus, which really isn't that surprising because, as Mr. Jeffrey Sachs said recently, America drops countries like hot potatoes. And Piers Morgan recently asked Jeffrey Sachs, Elon Musk said that the United States must leave NATO. What say you? And Jeffrey Sachs said that if the Europeans continue to maintain the war between Russia and Ukraine, then the United States will eventually leave NATO, and that is that. And so you see all these countries saying, oh, look, the United States just threw Ukraine under the bus. We cannot trust the Americans, and that is why you see the Germans talking about wanting to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on their military. That is why you see the Turks developing their own fighter jet. That is why you see the Japanese developing their own fighter jet. Why is this? Because these countries do not trust the United States, and if countries are not going to trust the United States, then how in the hell can you expect NATO to be kept intact? NATO, at the end of the day, is the American empire in Europe. It's the American empire. That is what NATO is. And so why do people join NATO? They join NATO because they want the security. But if they do not trust America for their security, if they do not believe that they can rely on the United States for their security, then how in the hell can you expect NATO to be kept intact? And that is why you see the Europeans talking about becoming more and more militarily independent. And really, the United States has a history of dropping its allies. It has a history of throwing its allies under the bus. We saw this back in the early 1900s. After the Japanese devastated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in 1905. The Russians were devastated by that war, and in the Battle of Mukden, 60,000 Russians lost their lives fighting the Japanese, and the Americans looked on and said, wow, look, watch as the Japanese slaughter all of these Russians because the Americans hated the Ruskies. And so the Americans said, hey, look, we can use these Japanese people. We can use these Japanese to slaughter the Russians. And before the Russo-Japanese War, there was the first Sino-Japanese War, in which the Japanese defeated the Chinese, and that war sparked in 1894, and it ended in 1895. And so the Americans watched as the Japanese crushed both the Chinese and the Russians. And the Americans said, wow, we can really use these Japanese as a proxy against the Russians and the Chinese. And the Americans empowered the Japanese. How did they empower the Japanese? Well, after the Japanese devastated the Russians, the Japanese wanted to invade the Koreans. They wanted to invade Korea because Korea was rich in iron and coal, and the Japanese wanted to get their hands on those natural resources. And so the Americans withdrew their troops out of Korea, and the Americans got the Europeans to withdraw their troops out of Korea, leaving Korea completely helpless, completely open to a Japanese invasion. The Japanese were coming to invade Korea, and the Koreans said, well, we are under a treaty with the Americans, and they were right. Back in 1882, the Americans signed a treaty with the Koreans in which the Americans agreed that if the territorial integrity of the Koreans were ever under threat, that the Americans would work diplomatically to protect Korea's territorial integrity. And so the Koreans thought, okay, well, we have a treaty with the Americans. Surely the Americans will come and help us. And so the Koreans sent a message to President Theodore Roosevelt, and they said, please help us, America, help us, protect us from the Japanese. You agreed to help us. We're under a treaty. And the Americans looked on and did not give a damn and did not lift a finger to help their Korean ally. And the Americans watched as the Japanese invaded Korea, and they didn't give a damn because the Americans believed that they could use the Japanese as a proxy against the Chinese and the Russians. And so they screwed over their ally, and they threw the Koreans under the bus, because the power of a treaty is only really there as long as that treaty serves an interest. If a treaty no longer serves a nation's interest, that nation will take that treaty and throw it out the window. You might as well just use that treaty for toilet paper. And so the Americans empowered the Japanese. They empowered the Japanese. In fact, if you look at the First Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1894 and ended in 1895, the Japanese defeated the Chinese even though the Chinese had more soldiers, even though the Chinese had more manpower. And why were the Japanese able to defeat the Chinese so efficiently? Well, because the Japanese had Western military technology. And how did that happen? The Americans forced the Japanese to buy American military technology. So the Japanese had the upper hand, and the Americans really began to empower the Japanese. And with that Western military technology, the Japanese were able to defeat the Chinese, and the Japanese were able to defeat the Russians, and thus began the beginning of the Japanese Empire, or really the beginning of Japan as a superpower in East Asia. And what enabled this? What enabled this was the United States' geopolitical interest against the Russians and the Chinese. And the Americans created this Japanese Frankenstein. And so the Americans will create monsters. And what happened in the end? What happened in the end was the Americans had to deal with this Japanese Leviathan that they contributed to. They had to deal with this Japanese monster that they helped to create. And so what do we see the Americans doing right now? We see the Americans creating a European monster. The Americans are sending out the message that the Europeans cannot rely on the Americans, and the Germans are saying, look, we cannot rely on the Americans. We can't trust the Americans for our security. We have to revive German power. And the Americans are giving them the green light. The Americans are saying, no, Germany, we want you to make your military strong again. Spend 5% of your GDP on your military. Hell, if you want to spend more than that, great. And the Germans are saying, okay, you want us to spend more on our military, we'll do that, but we really can't trust you, so we need to really create a German sphere of power over Europe. And that is why Olaf Scholz said some years ago that Germany must become the defender of Europe. And what would that look like? What that would look like is Germany being the most powerful country in Europe militarily. And what are the Americans also doing in the creation of this monster? The Americans are empowering the AfD. The Americans are empowering the far right. And right now, the Germans are talking about bringing back mandatory conscription. Well, which party in Germany is the most pro-mandatory conscription? It's the AfD. So in the midst of the Americans pushing for the revival of German militarism, we have also the Americans supporting the most militarist party in Germany, pushing the most pro-mandatory conscription party in Germany. So the Americans are creating a monster. Why? For the very reason why they helped to create the Japanese monster, to create a proxy against the Russians. The Americans watched as the Japanese devastated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and the Americans said, we can use these people. And so they took their treaty that they had with Korea and they threw it out the window. Didn't give a damn about Korea's territorial integrity. They took the treaty that they signed with the Koreans back in 1882 and they threw it out the window. And so what do we see? We see the Americans throwing the Ukrainians under the bus. And in doing so, they are sending out the message that you cannot trust the Americans. Thus, they are empowering the sentiment that says we cannot trust the Americans and therefore we must make Germany's military strong again. And so America is creating a monster, just like they helped to create the Japanese monster. And what happened? What happened in the end? What happened in the end was the Americans had to fight the very Japanese monster that they helped to create. And before World War II, the Americans empowered Germany. The Americans really enabled Germany to reindustrialize itself because the Americans gave all this money to Germany to fund its reindustrialization. And also what that enabled was the remilitarization of Germany. And so the Americans helped to create the German monster after World War I. And so the Americans helped to create the Japanese Leviathan. The Americans helped to create the German Leviathan. And it had to deal with these monsters that it created in the end. And so what is America doing right now? They are empowering the militarists of Germany, the AfD, who are really just, the AfD is really just a repackaged Nazi party. Their ranks are filled with Nazis. The AfD's most popular leader, Bjorn Höcke, is a Nazi. And the Americans are empowering this party, this Nazistic, Hitlerian, militaristic party. And they are creating a monster. And they are empowering German militarism by sending out this message that you cannot trust the Americans, giving the Germans the green light to remilitarize itself and to revive its military strength, because the Germans are saying, we can't trust you Americans, so of course we're going to make our military strong again, and of course we are going to create this German sphere of influence over Europe. That is why Olaf Scholz said that Germany must become the defender of Europe. And so the Americans are creating a monster, backing the Nazis, backing the militarists, enabling and greenlighting the revival of German militarism. They're creating a monster because the Americans think that they can use this monster against the Russians. And that's what's happening. And so what are the Americans going to do in the future? Well, in history, the Americans helped to create the Japanese monster and the German monster. And the Americans decided to destroy those monsters. And so America eventually is going to come to a crossroad. It's going to come to a situation where it's going to have to make a decision, because what's happening is the rise of Germany. You also see the rise of Turkey, and Germany and Turkey are allies. They've been allies going all the way back to Bismarck. And even when the Ottoman Empire was butchering the Armenians, the Germans were allies with the Ottomans. In fact, the Germans enabled the Ottomans to exterminate the Armenians, and the Germans were allied with the Ottomans against the British, against the Russians. That's not going to change. And so what's going to happen in the future is a revived Germany, a revived Turkey, and we're already seeing this revival of Turkish power. And so you're going to have a Turco-Germanic axis. This is what I see in the future, a Turco-Germanic axis. And this monster, if it does come into existence, this monster will be the creation of the United States. That's what it's going to be, because you're seeing America creating these monsters. America backs Turkey, and America is backing this revival of German militarism. America is backing the revival of German nationalism. America is backing the revival of Nazism, because the AfD is a repackaged Nazi party. It's filled with Nazis. Bjorn Höcke is a Nazi. This guy used to write articles defending the Third Reich. I mean, the guy is clearly a Nazi. And you see Elon Musk supporting this party. You see J.D. Vance supporting this party. America is creating monsters, just like in the past it created monsters. Back in the past, you had Henry Ford and Sosthenes Ben, these American industrialists, and you had these American figures in Wall Street who were backing Hitler and backing the Nazi party, and they supported the Nazis, and they supported the remilitarization of Germany. They were creating a monster. And today, what do? You see Elon Musk, America's biggest industrialist, working with the Turks, backing German nationalism. It's a rhyming of history. And America is creating monsters. And so America is eventually going to come to a place where it's going to have to make a decision. Because you're going to have this revived German power, you're going to have this revived Turkish power, and they are going to be against Russia. Just like in World War I, the Germans and the Turks were allies against Russia. And so you're going to have this revived German power, revived Turkish power. They're going to be against Russia. These will be monsters created by the United States. And America is going to have to come to a decision. Is it going to help these monsters of its own making, or is it going to work with the Russians just like it did back in World War I and World War II? America will eventually come to a place where it will have to make that decision. And it's really all just priming the world for more and more bloodshed. And if you look at World War I mean, what happened in World War I? You had the Armenian genocide. The Germans knew exactly what the Turks were doing, and the Germans were still allies with the Ottomans. In fact, the Germans said that we must support the Ottomans' extermination of the Armenians. And the world looked on. And for the most part, the world did not give a damn. And you had what? Back in 1904 and 1905, you had the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese devastated the Russians. 60,000 Russians were slaughtered in one battle, the Battle of Mukden. And the world looked on. And America saw the slaughter and said, wow, we can use these Japanese samurai. America didn't say, wow, look, that's awful. Look at all the lives that have been lost. We must work to prevent this sort of travesty. We must work to prevent this sort of tragedy. But America didn't say that. America said, wow, we can work with these Japanese. Let's work with them. Let's empower them. In fact, let's enable the Japanese to invade Korea. And the Japanese invaded Korea and they committed atrocities. And what happened? What happened in the 1930s and in the 1940s? The Japanese did atrocities in Korea. They used countless Korean women as sex slaves. They invaded China, and they killed millions of Chinese, and they raped hundreds of thousands of Chinese women, and they forced countless Chinese women to become sex slaves. And we see this horror, and we say, wow. And people really didn't give a damn. And Theodore Roosevelt wanted to use the Japanese against the Chinese. And Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was dead by this point, but he got what he wanted in the Second World War. The desire of Theodore Roosevelt was witnessed in the Second World War when the Japanese were butchering the Chinese by the millions and raping Chinese women by the hundreds of thousands. And so we create this monster not giving a damn about what horrors will come about due to the creation of such monsters. And what I have concluded is that when it comes to war, when it comes to conflicts, the last thing that governments care about is atrocities. We don't give a damn. America knew that Nazism was murderous. America knew that Hitler was a militarist and a maniac, but America still believed that they could use Hitler and use the Germans and use the Nazis as proxies against Bolshevism, against communism. And that's why you had all these Americans who loved Hitler. And that is why Winston Churchill admired fascism, and he admired the Nazis because he believed that the fascists and the Nazis could be used as a proxy against Bolshevism, against the left. And so there was this deception that was going on, this massive deception that was taking place, in which you had these Western figureheads who thought that this trend of ultranationalism was great because it could be used against the left and against communism. And what do we see today? We see America supporting ultranationalism with the intention of using ultranationalism against the left, against the woke. Just like in the past, the figureheads of the United States and Great Britain thought that they could use the nationalists, the German nationalists or the Italian nationalists, against the left. Today, we have American figureheads thinking that they can use German ultranationalism against the left, against the woke. And all we are doing is creating a monster. And we see Russia and we think, well, we have to what? We have to spur the Europeans to get their militaries back up. We have to spur the Europeans to bring back their militarism. We have to spur the Germans to revive their militarism and to revive their nationalism. And we don't give a damn about the horrors that German nationalism caused in the past, in history. We don't give a damn about the fact that German nationalism caused the deaths of countless millions of people in World War I and World War II. We don't give a damn about the fact that German nationalism was the foundational ideology of Nazism, and that the Nazis butchered countless lives, butchered millions of people. We don't give a damn. We've talked about the Holocaust for how many decades? And here we are backing what? German nationalism. Here we see J.D. Vance backing German nationalism. We see Elon Musk backing German nationalism because we think that, well, not we, I'm not in on this nightmare, but these people believe that they can use the nationalists against the woke, against the left. And you have these militarists who believe that they can use the nationalists against the Russians, because the AfD, or really the German far right, is the most militaristic faction in Germany. They will bring back mandatory conscription if that doesn't happen before they take power, and that's if they take power, and I think they will. They are the most pro-militarist faction in Germany. And so by empowering them, you are empowering the revival of German nationalism. And we look back in the past, we look back in history, and we see what? The countless lives lost because of German nationalism and because of German nationalist aspirations, and we don't give a damn. Just like when the Ottomans were genociding the Armenians, the Germans didn't give a damn, even though the Germans were traditionally a Christian people, and they knew that the Armenians were being butchered, and they said, we have to support the Ottomans' policy of extermination of the Armenians. And you had the major German military official in World War I, Mr. Hans von Sicht, who said that we must support the Armenian genocide and that we cannot allow our Christian sentiment to spur us to try to hinder the bloodshed. This is the evil that we are dealing with, and this is the evil that we are bringing back from the dead. The genie is out of the bottle, the demon is out of the lamp. We are bringing back this demon. We're bringing it back. And I see these figureheads, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, supporting this revival of German nationalism and militarism. And I'm thinking, this is all just evil. That's what this is. It's evil. It's like that scene from The Mummy when Evie is talking to O'Connell, and she says, I'm looking for a book in Egypt. Do you know what's out there in Hymenoptera? And Brendan Fraser's character says, in a word, evil. And that's what's out there. That is what we are witnessing. Evil. Evil in its pure manifestation. And it's very, very clear when you see this push to revive German nationalism or this push to revive German militarism. It is pure evil. And that's it. And the last thing that people give a damn about is genocides, atrocities, the loss of human life. Look at what Israel did in Gaza. Look at all the war crimes that Israel did in Gaza. No one gives a damn. The Americans don't give a damn. Look at what Israel is doing right now in the West Bank. They have pushed tens of thousands of people out of their homes. 40,000 Palestinians have been kicked out of their homes in the name of fighting terrorism, and the Americans don't give a damn. The majority of the Western media doesn't give a damn. People being pushed out of their homes, Israeli soldiers going to Palestinian homes and telling families that they have this many days to leave their home or else they're going to be hurt. And in one case that I read, a soldier told the Palestinian family, if you don't leave your home, we're going to burn down your house and you with it. The Azeris in Turkey's war in Nagorno-Karabakh that began in 2020 drove around Armenian villages with loudspeakers saying, if you Armenians don't leave, we're going to kill you. And over 100,000 Armenians were driven out of their homes by Israel's and America's ally in the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, and no one gave a damn. America doesn't give a damn. If people really cared about atrocities and holocausts and genocides, then they would not be working to revive German militarism and German nationalism. Knowing the history from World War I and World War II, if we really gave a damn about atrocities and genocides, we wouldn't be working to revive Turkish power. The Americans backed the Turks in their takeover of Syria. And we know full well that when the Turks did the Armenian genocide, much of that genocide was done in Syria. And we are giving this country back to the very people who orchestrated a genocide in Syria? We don't give a damn about atrocities or genocides or any of that stuff. If we did, we would not be working with all of our efforts to revive the Ottoman monster and the German monster or the Japanese monster. And right now, what are we working with? We're working with the Japanese. We want the Japanese to revive their military strength so that we can use it as a proxy against the Chinese. Oh, that's exactly what Theodore Roosevelt thought. And the American government created that Japanese monster only to have to deal and to face that monster in the future, in the Second World War. America is creating monsters, and America is going to have to come to a decision. Is it going to fight those monsters that it's creating right now, or is it going to side with those monsters? And time will tell. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.